Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to CSIS. I'm Ernie Bauer. I'm the Sumitro Chair for Southeast Asian Studies. And we're very pleased today to welcome you to the Banyan Tree Leadership Forum. We have a very special speaker, Justice Antonio Carpio, the Senior Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the Philippines. I'd also like to recognize some of our guests from the ASEAN ambassadors, Ambassador Pham Quang Vinh and Ambassador Awang Hussein from Malaysia. As you know, the Southeast Asia program here at CSIS has focused intensively on questions around the South China Sea and the legal, political, security, and economic situation in that area. And today we will hear about the legal perspective. To introduce the Justice, I'd like to invite a man who's worked tirelessly to represent his country, the Republic of the Philippines, in the United States, Joey Quisha. Ambassador Quisha has been a real leader on the U.S.-Philippine relationship, and certainly has been a very active partner of ours in looking at issues around maritime security in Asia. So without further ado, I'd like to ask you to join me in welcoming Ambassador Joey Quisha.
Thank you, Ernie, for your very kind introduction. The Honorable Antonio Carpio, Senior Associate Justice of the Philippine Supreme Court, Mrs. Ruth Carpio, Excellencies, Sir Ernie Bauer, Sumitro Chair for Southeast Asia Studies at CSIS, distinguished guests, good afternoon to all of you. There is never a dull moment in Washington, D.C., and fall always brings a flurry of visitors into town. The visits of Pope Francis and President Xi, within days of each other, have certainly given Washington's policy community much to talk about. Immigration, poverty, climate change were among the issues discussed by President Obama with Pope Francis, while cybersecurity, climate change, and the security situation in the South China Sea figured at the top of the agenda of President Obama's discussion with President Xi. The South China Sea issue has certainly been a major topic of discussion lately. Today, we're privileged to have the Honorable Antonio Carpio, Senior Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the Philippines, to speak about China's 9-dash line. Justice Carpio asserts that this 9-dash line is the root cause of the disputes in the South China Sea. Today's lecture will give us all a better understanding why the Philippines has brought its case to the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague in January of 2013, after exhausting all diplomatic efforts at the bilateral, regional, and multilateral levels. Oral arguments on jurisdiction were heard by the tribunal in July in The Hague, and the Philippines looks forward to a decision before the year is over. Justice Carpio was sworn in as a member of the Supreme Court of the Philippines in 2001. He brings to the Supreme Court his solid experience as founding partner of a private practice law firm, as well as Chief Presidential Legal Counsel at the Office of the President from 1992 until 1996. I was, of course, privileged to have served also with Justice Carpio in the administration of President Fidel Ramos. He spent close to a decade as professorial lecturer at his alma mater, the University of the Philippines, and his love for teaching has stayed with him. When not in his judicial robe, he devotes a significant amount of his time to sharing his knowledge about UNCLOS and his research on China's ancient maps and how they relate to international law. His colleagues describe him as a Renaissance man. He hunts and sails, and in fact was a commodore at the Manila Yacht Club. He's handy with a gun in the shooting range and is widely acknowledged as the Supreme Court's in-house techie. I'm told he runs a paperless office and was responsible for the Supreme Court's e-library. Maritime security in the South China Sea will continue to impact U.S.-China relations and China's relations with its neighbors. We're pleased that Justice Carpio's speaking tour in the U.S. kicks off today at CSIS. He will also be speaking in New York and San Francisco. His thoughts will certainly enrich the discourse on what has been characterized by Professor Michael Kasich of Stephen Austin State University as possibly the single most important dispute in the world today. My personal thanks go to Ernie Bauer and his team at CSIS for supporting this event under the Banyan Tree Leadership Forum. Indeed, Justice Carpio is a thought leader in this subject matter. Lastly, perhaps I should have started with this, a warm welcome to Justice Carpio and Mrs. Ruth Carpio. Thank you for sharing your knowledge, Justice Carpio, and thoughts on this very important topic. Thank you and good day to all of you.
Thank you, Ambassador Joey Quisha, for those kind words. Good afternoon to everyone. Allow me to thank CSIS, represented here by Mr. Ernie Bowers, for hosting this lecture. Allow me to thank the Philippine Embassy, headed by Ambassador Joey Quisha, for arranging this lecture. And allow me to thank everyone present here for attending this lecture. The South China Sea dispute has grave implications on the peace, security, and stability, not only of Asia, but also the rest of the world. Half of the world's seaborne trade passes through the South China Sea, valued at $5.3 trillion annually, and of that, $1.2 trillion is US bound. The South China Sea dispute has the potential to overturn the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, the Constitution for the Oceans and Seas of our planet. For the Philippines, what is at stake is 80% of its exclusive economic zone and 100% of its extended continental shelf in the South China Sea. Either the Philippines keeps them or loses them to China. The root cause of the South China Sea dispute is China's 9 lines claim, which gobbles up large areas of the EEZs of the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and Indonesia. If you look at the map, you can readily see that. These are the 9 lines. These are the exclusive economic zones, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, Malaysia again, Indonesia, and Vietnam. And these are the 9 lines. The high seas are here, also gobbled up by the 9 lines. That's the map of the 9 lines that China submitted to the United Nations on 7 May 2009. China did not explain the legal basis for the dashes. The dashes had no fixed coordinates. And that map was attached to a note verbal that China submitted to the UN. The note verbal states China's indisputable sovereignty over the islands in the South China Sea and the adjacent waters, and enjoys sovereign rights and jurisdiction over the relevant waters as well as the seabed and subsoil thereof. Now, China has not explained the terms adjacent or relevant waters. These are not terms of UNCLOS. Up to now, China refuses to explain the meanings of these terms. So we can divine the meaning of these terms only if we look at the activities of China in the South China Sea. So in 1988, China seized Subi Reef from the Philippines. Subi Reef is located in the high seas of the South China Sea. It's a low tide elevation. At high tide, it's totally submerged. It's part of the extended continental shelf of the Philippines. And China seized that and put up a radar station. In 1987, yes, that's it. Under UNCLOS, Subi Reef, being part of the extended continental shelf of the Philippines, It's only the Philippines that can put up any artificial structure there. In 1995, China seized Mischief Reef from the Philippines. Mischief Reef is well within our EEZ. It's a low tide elevation, fully submerged at high tide. Under UNCLOS, only the Philippines can put up an artificial structure here, but China just ignored that and put up a structure here. China said it's a shelter for fishermen. That shelter turned out to be a military garrison. Now China is reclaiming that. So that's the meaning of adjacent relevant waters. China seized the high seas. China seized what belongs to the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines. In 2011, the Philippines bidded out this area, areas 3 and 4, for foreign exploitation. On 4 July 2011, China protested and sent a note verbal to the Philippines saying that the Chinese government urges the Philippine side to immediately withdraw the bidding offer in areas 3 and 4 and refrain from any action that infringes on China's sovereignty and sovereign rights. In other words, China claims sovereignty and sovereign rights over areas 3 and 4. This is in the Reed Bank. That's the meaning of adjacent and relevant waters for China. In 2011, since 2011, we have been sending survey ships to explore the Reed Bank, but Chinese Coast Guard vessels have been harassing our survey ships. This is Malampaya, our largest operating gas field in the Philippines, supplying 40% of the energy requirement of Luzon, our largest island. The 9-dash lines cuts through Malampaya. In 10 to 12 years, Malampaya will run out of gas, so we have to develop Reed Bank, but we cannot develop Reed Bank because Chinese Coast Guard vessels harass our survey ships. In 2012, China published this map entitled Location for Part of Open Blocks in Waters Under the Jurisdiction of the People's Republic of China, available for foreign cooperation in 2012. In other words, China auctioned off these blocks here. This is Vietnam, Hainan. These are the 9-dash lines, and this is the EEZ of Vietnam, the extended continental shelf of Vietnam. So all these blocks are within the EEZ of Vietnam and the extended continental shelf of Vietnam. But China said, we own this, we are offering it for exploitation, exploration by foreign companies. That's the meaning of adjacent and relevant waters under the 9-dash lines of China. In 2013, China released a new map of China, adding a 10th dash on the eastern side of Taiwan. So the 9-dash lines are still growing. China claims the 9-dash lines the 10-dash lines are China's national boundaries without explaining the legal basis or giving the fixed coordinates. The map was published by Sinomap Press, an official mapping agency of China, and we had to protest strongly. In a note verbal that the Philippines sent to China on June 7, 2013, the Philippines strongly objected to the indication that the 9-dash lines are China's national boundaries in the West Philippine Sea, South China Sea, because whatever is enclosed by your national boundaries constitute your national territory, and we have to object. This is the map that China published in 2013. This is Taiwan. The 10th dash was added there, and the legend of the map shows that this shading is the national boundary of China, and these are the shading of the 9-dash lines. China calls the 9-dash lines its national boundaries, the same shading that China uses for its continental boundaries here. So China treats the waters as equivalent to its land territory. James Shoal, China claims James Shoal as its southernmost border. James Shoal is 950 nautical miles from Hainan, about 400 nautical miles from Ituaba in the Spratlys. It's a fully submerged area, 22 meters below the surface of the water. It's not even a low tide elevation. Now, under UNCLOS, the maximum that the coastal state can claim is 350 nautical miles from baselines along its coast. This is James Shoal, 950 nautical miles from Hainan. China calls this its southernmost border. So all the waters here are part of the territory of China, if that is the southernmost border of China. For the last few years, China has been sending to James Shoal a naval task force, and the sailors in that naval task force hold an oath-swearing ceremony, taking an oath to defend with their lives the southernmost border of China. In 2012, China seized Scarborough Shoal from the Philippines. There was a standoff from April to June of 2012. The Americans brokered the agreement that the Chinese Coast Guard vessels and Philippine Coast Guard vessels mutually withdraw. We agreed, China agreed, but when our vessels withdrew, the Chinese did not, and they stayed there up to now. They have stayed there up to now. And Scarborough Shoal is only 124 nautical miles from Luzon, well within our EEZ. It has been our traditional fishing ground since the Spanish times, but we cannot fish there anymore because China has seized that shoal. In 2013, China seized Lucuña Shoals from Malaysia. Last June 4, 2015, the security advisor of Malaysia published this in his Facebook, and he stated in his Facebook, "This small island is not a disputed territory, but a foreign ship which came here as intruded into our national waters. This is the ship, the Hainan 1123. It anchored on Lucuña Shoals since April 2013 and has not left the shoal up to now." Lucuña Shoal is one of the largest reef formations in the Spratlys. It's rich in fisheries, oil and gas. There are Malaysian oil and gas around this area. So China sees that. That's the meaning of adjacent and relevant waters under the 9 dash lines. In 2014, China, through Hainan province, issued a fisheries regulation claiming that these are the waters administered by Hainan. Any foreign ship, foreign fishing vessel wanting to fish here must secure permission from China. It includes the high seas. That's the fishing regulation of China. Article 35 of Hainan's fishery regulation states, foreign fishing vessels entering the waters under the jurisdiction of Hainan to fish must secure approval from Chinese authorities. That's the meaning of adjacent and relevant waters. China claims the high seas as its own. In 2014, China installed its oil rig within the EEZ of Vietnam. Vietnamese workers rioted and burned several Chinese factories. A Vietnamese fishing boat sank near the oil rig after being rammed by Chinese vessels. So that's the meaning of adjacent and relevant waters. China claims the EEZ of Vietnam. All of these acts of China, among so many others, demonstrate beyond doubt that China is claiming sovereignty, sovereign rights, and jurisdiction to all the waters, fisheries, seabed, and subsoil enclosed by the 9 dash lines. That's the meaning of the 9 dash lines. What is the effect of China's national boundaries under the 9 dash lines? The Philippines loses about 80% of its EEZ facing the West Philippine Sea, including the entire reed bank and part of the Malampaya gas field. Malaysia loses also about 80% of its EEZ in Sabah and Sarawak facing the South China Sea, as well as most of its active gas and oil fields in the same area. These are the active gas and oil fields that have powered the economic development of Malaysia. Vietnam loses about 50% of its total EEZ. Brunei loses about 90% of its total EEZ. Indonesia loses about 30% of its EEZ facing the South China Sea in the Tuna Islands, whose surrounding waters comprise the largest gas field in Southeast Asia and the second largest in the world. So the Philippines will be left with a sliver of water as its territorial sea and EEZ. Every time we cross, our Navy ships cross the dotted line here, we enter into Chinese territory. Of course, China says there is freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, but we must understand that China, the basis of China is they have indisputable sovereignty over the South China Sea, and if there is freedom of navigation, it's only by courtesy, by generosity or liberality of China. They can withdraw that at any time. China continues to mass-produce warships, destroyers, frigates, corvettes, and other warships at a faster rate than any other country in world history during peacetime. According to the U.S. Office of Naval Intelligence, during 2014 alone, more than 60 naval ships and crafts were laid down, launched, or commissioned, with a similar number expected through the end of 2015. That's the Type 56 corvette of China. There's one of their smallest warships. The bigger ones are the frigates, the destroyers, and the aircraft carrier. That was launched last March 19. This year, the 25th corvette of China of this type. China plans a total of 40, and the Chinese say that just 20 of these can control the South China Sea. These are ideal for basing in its naval bases in the Spratlys that China is building. China has a second navy, its Coast Guard. It has the largest Coast Guard in the world, larger than the combined Coast Guard of Japan, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. That's the largest Coast Guard vessel in the world at 10,000 tons. A sister ship is being constructed also. This acts as the second navy of China. China sends its Coast Guard to harass fishermen from the Philippines, while their gray ships, their naval ships, are just over the horizon, waiting to reinforce their Coast Guard vessels. What will China do with all of these naval assets? The number one purpose, of course, is to enforce the national 9 dash lines as China's national boundaries. China released this year its China military strategy. It's the white paper of China. And China said, we will shift from offshore water defense to open seas protection. The white paper states the traditional mentality that land outweighs the sea must be abandoned, and great importance has to be attached to managing the seas and oceans and protecting maritime rights and interests. Protecting maritime rights and interests are China's code word for enforcing the 9 dash lines as China's national boundaries. Those are the maritime zones under UNCLOS. You have the low water mark here. You measure 12 nautical miles, that's the territorial sea. You measure 200 nautical miles, that's the EEZ. If the continental shelf, there is a natural prolongation of the continental shelf, then a coastal state is entitled to an additional 150 nautical miles extended continental shelf. The high sea starts from here. All the fish here belong to mankind. This is the area, the common heritage of mankind, administered by the International Seabed Authority. The authority has issued 27 licenses to explore the seabed. 4 have gone to China, the largest number for any state. Now, the maximum that a coastal state can claim is 350 nautical miles. 12 territorial sea, 200 nautical miles EEZ, and up to 350 nautical miles as your extended continental shelf. That's the maximum. China claims much more than that, up to 950 nautical miles. What is a low tide elevation? This is an important concept in the dispute. A low tide elevation is a naturally formed area of land above water at high tide, but above water at low tide, but submerged at high tide. In other words, at low tide you see it, at high tide you don't see it. Now, a low tide elevation is part of the submerged continental shelf. It is not land, it is not territory. It has no territorial sea, it has no territorial airspace. If it is located beyond the territorial sea, it's not subject to appropriation by any state. Most of the reclamations of China in the South China Sea are low tide elevations, and we will see that later. So at low tide, you see this rock, another rock, and this island. At high tide, this is submerged. So this is a low tide elevation. This is a rock above water at high tide. Even if it's only 1 inch above water at high tide, it's entitled to a 12 nautical mile territorial sea. That's huge. It's about 155,000 hectares of surface area. Now, this is an island. It has 12 nautical mile territorial sea. If it's capable of human habitation of its own, it's entitled to 200 nautical mile EEZ. And if it can prove a natural prolongation of its continental shelf, it's entitled to an additional 150 nautical mile. extended continental shelf. So a maximum of 350 nautical miles. China claims more than that. What is our dispute with China that we have brought to the UNCLOS tribunal? It is a maritime dispute, and the most important issue we have raised is this: whether the waters enclosed by China's 9-dash lines can encroach on the EEZ of the Philippines in the West Philippine Sea. That's the major issue that we raised, and if that issue is raised favorably, then the dispute in the South China Sea will be reduced drastically from the entire South China Sea to just the territorial sea of the islands in the Spratlys. The Philippines is not asking the tribunal to rule who owns those rocks, who has sovereignty over those rocks. We are asking the tribunal to rule what are the maritime entitlements of those rocks, whether it's 0, 12 nautical miles, or 200 nautical miles. But China is saying before the tribunal can rule on the maritime entitlements, the tribunal must first determine who has sovereignty over those rocks. If that were the case, then the tribunal would have no jurisdiction because UNCLOS does not regulate territorial disputes, it settles only maritime disputes. So how do we answer that argument? Well, this is Scarborough Shoal. It is just 1.2 meters above water at high tide. Not a single blade of grass grows here. You cannot squeeze a single drop of fresh water. So obviously, it's incapable of human habitation. If it's incapable of human habitation, it's only entitled to 12 nautical mile territorial sea. Whether it's owned by China, the Philippines, or some other country will not matter because that will not change the fact that it's not capable of human habitation. So we're saying the tribunal does not have to rule who has sovereignty over Scarborough Shoal because that's not needed to determine the maritime entitlement. That's mischief reef. It's totally submerged at high tide under international law. A low tide elevation beyond the territorial sea is not capable of ownership by any state. It's subject to sovereignty. So we are saying that the tribunal need not determine who has, whether this is capable, who has sovereignty over this, because in the first place, it's not capable of sovereignty. Nobody can own this because under international law, a low tide elevation beyond the territorial sea is not subject to sovereignty. So the tribunal can rule that if this is a low tide elevation, it's not entitled to a territorial sea. That's the 9-dash lines of China. China says the basic principle under the law of the sea is land dominates the sea, and therefore China says the tribunal must first determine ownership of the land, who has sovereignty over their land, before it can determine the maritime zones coming out of that land. But what we say is that, look at the 9-dash lines. It is not based on land. It is not measured from land. China doesn't explain from where it drew these lines. Since it is not based on land, it cannot claim any maritime zone. What governs the 9-dash lines is the principle, the absence of land dominates no sea. Now, China is reclaiming on 7 reefs in the Spratlys. These are the 7 reefs that China occupies. But it is also, China is also dredging 10 other reefs to get filling materials to dredge to reclaim the 7 reefs that it occupies. And China said that the primary purpose of the reclamation is civilian. China is saying the purpose is to provide better services to vessels from China, her neighbors, and other countries sailing in the South China Sea, to provide search and rescue, disaster prevention, and mitigation to all countries in the South China Sea. We tell China, no, thank you, please don't do that. That's Fiery Cross Reef before the reclamation. Fiery Cross Reef is about 1 meter above water at high tide. In 1987, UNESCO agreed with China that China would build a weather station on Fiery Cross Reef as part of the Global Oceanic Survey. That weather station would later turn out to be a Chinese military air and naval base. China reclaimed that, but before China reclaimed it, China State Shipbuilding Corporation uploaded this in its website saying this is the purpose of the reclamation on Fiery Cross Reef. It's a runway, and that's a swept wing. That's the H-6K of China, the strategic bomber of China. These are hangars. These are windmills to generate electricity. And the website explained this will be a 270-hectare reclamation. At 270, it's more than twice as big as Diego Garcia Island, the U.S. Air Base in the Indian Ocean, which is only about 100 hectares. Bigger than Woody Island, the largest island in the Paracels. It's a 3,000-kilometer runway. Now, after the reclamation, China posted this photo. China said, we finished the reclamation, and posted this photo, exactly the same as the one that they posted in the website before the reclamation. Admiral Harris, the U.S. commander in the U.S. Pacific Command, said that a 3-kilometer runway is large enough to take a B-52, almost large enough for the space shuttle, and 3,000 feet longer than what you need to take off on a Boeing 747. And Admiral Harris said China is also building hangars for tactical fighter jets. That's the H-6K of China. It's their strategic bomber. It has a range of 7,000 kilometers. It carries 6 cruise missiles, conventionally armed or nuclear armed. This can fly from Fiery Cross Reef towards Australia, and before reaching Australia, 1,000 kilometers before reaching Australia, it can release its cruise missiles, which has the range of 2,200 kilometers, turn back. The cruise missiles are satellite guided, and all U.S. military facilities in northern Australia are within range of the cruise missiles. That's Johnson South Reef before the reclamation. It's a low tide elevation within our EEZ. That's how it looked like, June 19. Radar dome, tall buildings, 4 to 5 stories, solar panel. Now, South Johnson Reef was occupied by the Vietnamese. In 1988, Chinese naval forces forcibly dislodged the Vietnamese and killed 77 Vietnamese soldiers in that skirmish. McKinnon Reef before the reclamation. McKinnon Reef after the reclamation. Again, those tall buildings, maybe this will become the command and control center for the maritime Silk Road of China. That's Gaven Reef before the reclamation. Gaven Reef as of May 9. Quartern Reef before the reclamation. Quartern Reef as of May 7. Tall buildings again. Subi Reef before the reclamation. As I said, Subi Reef is located in the high seas. It's totally submerged at high tide, so it's part of the submerged continental shelf. It is just outside the territorial sea of Pag-asa, the largest island that the Philippines occupies. So China has reclaimed this. And as of August 14, that's how it looked. There will be a 3-kilometer runway here. And this, before the reclamation, at the depth of 22 meters. So it's deeper now. It's ideal harbor for warships and submarines. This is the channel, the exit and entry for the warships and submarines. Under Article 88 of UNCLOS, the high seas shall be reserved for peaceful purposes. China is building a naval base, converting it for military purposes. And this has grave implications for the security of the world, because if China is allowed to create an artificial island out of a submerged area in the high seas, convert it into a naval or air base, then there will be an island building race among naval powers to build naval bases in the high seas by creating islands, if this is allowed by the tribunal. The Mischief Reef before the reclamation, at the start of the reclamation. China, there was a Chinese news report last September 17 that China has already reclaimed 560 hectares out of a planned 800 hectares in Mischief Reef. That's Mischief Reef reclamation as of September 3. At 800 hectares total planned reclamation, that would be bigger than some of our cities in Metro Manila. So this is a 3-kilometer runway again. This will be a naval base. That's the channel for the entry and exit for warships and submarines. This is a natural harbor, very good, because it's the average depth is 26 meters. So very ideal, and that's the big worry of our naval commanders, because Mischief Reef is between, this is Palawan, and the Spratlys Islands that we occupy are here, and Mischief Reef is in the middle, about 125 nautical miles from Palawan, almost midway in our EEZ. And if this becomes an air and naval base with thousands of troops garrisoned here, we will have a hard problem of resupplying our troops that occupy our islands in the Spratlys. This is Second Thomas Shoal, where we have beached this dilapidated ship manned by 12 Marines of the Philippine Army. And we are able to supply this ship now with small crafts, and the Chinese Coast Guard vessels cannot enter the shallow waters of the reefs. But once they have a naval base here, they will have small crafts also guarding that reef 24 hours a day, and we'll have a hard time maintaining that reef, the Second Thomas Shoal. Now, of course, the reclamations violate the Declaration of Conduct. China and ASEAN signed the Declaration of Conduct in 2002, and the declaration states the parties undertake to exercise self-restraint, like refraining from action of inhabiting on presently uninhabited islands, reef, shoals, cays, and other features. President Xi Jinping was here recently, and he said the parties must comply with the Declaration of Conduct so that there will be peace and stability in the South China Sea. But of course, they are the first to violate the Declaration of Conduct. That's Woody Island, the largest island in the Paracels. It's an air base of China. It has a 2,700-meter runway. China is extending it to 3,000 meters. And so China has an existing air base in the South China Sea. And with it's here, the air base in the Paracels, Woody Island, China is putting up 3 here. And I suspect, this is my personal assessment, China will reclaim Scarborough Shoal to put up a 3rd air base, a naval base. So they will have a triangle of air bases to impose an ADIS in the South China Sea. And an air and naval base in Scarborough Shoal would be ideal for China because the submarines of China are based in Hainan. They cannot fire their missiles here because their missiles have a range of only 7,500 kilometers. They have to cross the Bassi Channel and fire their missiles in mid-Pacific to hit continental USA. So they have to protect the channel here, the Bassi Channel, their only outlet to the Pacific from the South China Sea. Last April, China conducted sea drills. They sent their strategic bomber, the H-6K, on a drill in the Western Pacific, crossing the Bassi Channel. Last June, China held air and sea drills here in the Bassi Channel, and China announced that they will conduct regular air and sea military drills in the Bassi Channel. So it's very important for China to keep the Bassi Channel open for them, and an air base in Scarborough Shoal would give them that protection. And an air base here will bring their H-Ski bombers closer to Guam, and their fighter jets and reconnaissance planes can now patrol the Western Pacific from an air base in Scarborough Shoal. So what has happened from 1946 to 2015 in the South China Sea? Before the war, the southernmost territory of China was Hainan Island. Not a single Chinese sailor or soldier was stationed in the South China Sea outside of Hainan Island. During the war, Japan seized the Paracels from the French and established a submarine base in Ituaba. After the war, with the departure of the Japanese, China seized the Amphitrite group of the Paracels and Ituaba in the Spratlys. So China moved its southernmost defense perimeter to the Paracels, the Amphitrite group, and Ituaba here in the Spratlys. The French regained possession of the Crescent group, and the South Vietnamese succeeded the French. But in 1974, China forcibly evicted the South Vietnamese in the Crescent Group in the Battle of the Paracels, widening their defense perimeter here. In 1988, China seized South Johnson Reef from the Communist Vietnamese. 1995, China seized Mischief Reef from the Philippines. 2012, China seized Scarborough Shoal from the Philippines. 2013, China seized Lucuña Shoals from Malaysia. So from 1946 to 2015, China moved its defense perimeter close to the 9 dash lines. And starting last year, late last year and this year, China started to build air and naval bases in the Spratlys. With those air and naval bases, China now can enforce the 9 dash lines as China's national boundaries in the South China Sea. So what is the grand design of China in the South China Sea? China's grand design is to control the South China Sea for economic and military purposes. China wants all the fisheries, oil, gas, and mineral resources within the 9 dash lines. China is the largest fishing fleet in the world with 70,000 vessels. They need only 7,000 to fish in the South China Sea. The rest of their vessels go all the way to Africa, competing with European fishing fleets. China's per capita fish consumption is the highest in the world at 35.1 kilograms per year to feed 1.3 billion people, while the rest of Asia is only 21.6 kilograms a year. China is the largest net importer of petroleum in the world. China also wants the South China Sea as a sanctuary for its nuclear-armed submarines, free from surveillance by U.S. submarine hunting Poseidons and U.S. nuclear attack submarines. The reclamations in the Spratlys are not a knee-jerk reaction to the Philippine arbitration case, but part of China's long-term grand design. As Zhang Ji, head of the Asia-Pacific Security Program, attached to the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, stated, China has wanted to do this for a long time. Now it has the dredging boats, the money, and the people, so it is doing it. Mischief Reef. Mischief Reef is a 30 million work of nature. Mischief Reef is an atoll reef. That means it was formed out of a sunken volcano. As the volcano sinks to the bottom of the sea, the reef grows. The reefs are formed by tiny sea animals called corals. It takes 30 million years for an atoll reef like Mischief Reef to form. And what is the value of this reef? This is a spawning ground of fish. The egg and larvae of the fish here, that spawn here, are carried by currents all the way to the coast of Vietnam, the coast of China, the coast of Palawan, Indonesia, Sulusi, Luzon. 20% of the fish that the Philippines catch annually from the wild are spawned in the Spratlys. And the fish here are interbreed with the fish in the Coral Triangle and the Verde Island Passage. There are connectivities. So they enrich each other in biodiversity, and that's very important for the marine life. But China destroyed 17 of these reefs in less than 18 months. That's the largest dredging vessel in Asia, and this is the rotating steel cutter. This is the largest dredging vessel that China sent to the Spratlys. This is a rotating steel cutter, and how does it work? The rotating cutter is dropped to the bottom of the sea. It grinds and pulverizes the coral. There's a suction here that sucks the pulverized coral into the ship, and the pulverized materials are pushed through these pipes by pressure and deposited at the rim of the reef. And all the reefs here are dead now. They've been pulverized, and the reefs here are also dead. They've been covered with the pulverized materials. These are the floating pipes that were washed ashore to Zambales from the Spratlys. That's how the dredgers work. They dredge the lagoon and pile all the pulverized sand here. According to Dr. John McNamara, a renowned marine biologist from the University of Miami, who has studied marine life in the Spratlys, China's reclamations are the most rapid permanent loss of coral reef in human history. It is a terrible, terrible thing to do this, according to Dr. McManus. Who can create artificial islands or erect structures on low tide elevations in the EEZ or extended continental shelf? Only the adjacent coastal state. And that adjacent coastal state is the Philippines. Very important, so we look at the specific provision in UNCLOS, Article 60 of UNCLOS, on artificial islands, installation structures in the exclusive economic zone. In the exclusive economic zone, the coastal state shall have the exclusive right to construct and to authorize and regulate the construction, operation, and use of artificial islands, installation structures for any economic purpose. The coastal state shall have the exclusive jurisdiction over such artificial islands, installation structures. It's the Philippines that is the coastal state. China is 950 nautical miles away, more than 350 nautical miles maximum limit under UNCLOS. It's the Philippines that's the coastal state. It's the Philippines that can construct artificial islands on its EEZ, like Mischief Reef. It's within our EEZ, totally submerged at high tide. Only the Philippines can construct. But China just ignored that. How about the extended continental shelf outside our EEZ but within our extended continental shelf? Article 80 of UNCLOS, artificial islands, installation structures on the continental shelf. Article 60, the one that I read earlier, applies to artificial islands, installation, and structures on the continental shelf. Again, it's only the Philippines that can reclaim Subi Reef, that can install artificial structures on Subi Reef. It's a totally submerged reef at high tide, but China just ignored that. That's Mischief Reef. It's within our EEZ, a low tide elevation, so it's only the Philippines that can reclaim that. Subi Reef, within our extended continental shelf, it's only the Philippines. Do low tide elevations and artificial islands acquire a maritime zone if by reclamation they are raised above water at high tide? No. UNCLOS says an island is a naturally formed area of land surrounded by water above water at high tide. In fact, there's a specific provision in UNCLOS, Article 60. Artificial islands, installation structures do not possess the status of islands. They have no territorial sea of their own. They have no territorial space, airspace, if they have no territorial sea. So, Subi Reef, it's not an island. It's just a structure. So there is no territorial sea, there's no territorial airspace. Mischief Reef, it's not an island. It has no territorial sea, no territorial space. The US says, we will fly over Subi Reef and Mischief Reef. They have a right to do that because these islands, artificial islands, do not have a territorial airspace, do not have a territorial sea. But Fiery Cross Reef is a rock above water at high tide. It is land. It is a territorial sea of 12 nautical miles in a territorial airspace. So the Americans must respect whoever owns that. That's a disputed reef, the Fiery Cross Reef. So the US can exercise its freedom of navigation and overflight over Mischief Reef and Subi Reef in accordance with international law. Do LTEs and artificial islands acquire a maritime zone? Finish that. So reclamations tamper with the evidence. How do we prove now to the tribunal that these are low tide elevations when China has fully reclaimed them and it's now above water at high tide? Well, we can show that the nautical charts of China before the reclamation designate these features as low tide elevation. Our own nautical charts also designate these features as low tide elevation. The nautical charts of US, UK, Japan, Russia, and Vietnam all designate these features as low tide elevation, so we can still prove they are low tide elevations. Can a state claim historic rights in the EEZ or extended continental shelf of another state? No. The UNCLOS was negotiated from 1973 to 1982. And China actively participated in the negotiation. At that time, countries had different claims to the exclusive economic zone. The U.S. started it with the Truman Proclamation of 1946, claiming 200 nautical miles. Chile and Peru followed, claiming even more, up to 500 nautical miles. Arab states followed, other countries followed. It was a big mess. Unless there was a compromise on what will be the extent of the extended of the exclusive economic zone, there would be no law of the sea. So everybody compromised that the EEZ shall be 200 nautical miles from the coastline. China agreed. That means that everybody will waive all historic claims to areas beyond the 200 nautical mile EEZ. China agreed. We all agreed. Today, China says we are entitled to 200 nautical mile EEZ from our coastline, but we claim historic rights to the rest of the South China Sea. They cannot do that, because if they can do that, then forget about the law of the sea, because everybody will claiming beyond the 200 nautical miles, then that will be the end of the law of the sea. In fact, there's a specific provision in UNCLOS. If the coastal state does not explore the continental shelf or exploit its natural resources, no one may undertake such activities without the express consent of the coastal state. The continental shelf covers the EEZ extended continental shelf. So even if the Philippines will do nothing with its EEZ or extended continental shelf, China cannot appropriate that for itself. That's granted to us by international law. Freedom of navigation. From the start of the EEZ here to the high seas, there's freedom of navigation. Freedom of navigation for merchant ships, warships, and aircraft, whether civilian or military. However, China says, in our EEZ, before warships can enter, before warplanes can fly over, they must secure permission from China. And that's the big dispute between China and the US. China belongs to the small minority of countries, about 20 of them, that adopt that position, that in the EEZ, there is no freedom of navigation for military aircraft or warship. But recently, China held naval drills in the Mediterranean. In the Mediterranean, there are overlapping EEZs, there are no high seas. And China conducted naval drills together with Russia a few months ago without seeking permission from the coastal states. Also recently, China sent a naval task force to the Bering Sea. They crossed the EEZ of the Aleutian, US Aleutians, and the territorial sea of the US Aleutians without seeking permission. So it looks like China is going to abandon its position that in the EEZ there's no freedom of navigation for military warships. That has been the case of USSR before. At the start of the Cold War, the USSR said there's no freedom of navigation for warships in our EEZ. But once they developed a blue water navy, they abandoned that position, because what will they do with their blue water navy if they have to seek permission whenever they sail through the EEZ of coastal states? So I can see that there will be soon an agreement, probably between China and the US, that in the EEZ, warships can sail, warplanes can fly without securing permission from the coastal state. The high seas have always been part of the global commons, whether before or after UNCLOS. UNCLOS states the high seas are open to all states, whether coastal or landlocked. Freedom of the high seas comprises, among others, freedom to fish. So in the high seas, even a country like Nepal, Laos, or Switzerland, landlocked countries, have a right to fish in the high seas. The US has a right to fish in the high seas of the South China Sea. All countries. It's open to everyone. So the US is, in fact, a real party in interest when China claims the high seas as its own. The whole world have a real interest to intervene in this dispute because China is claiming the global commons. That's the high seas. 20% of the South China Sea constitute the high seas. And China said, foreign fishing vessels cannot fish here without our permission. That's against UNCLOS, and everybody has a right to intervene to enforce the law of the sea there. Hainan claims this as the waters it administers. It includes the high seas. So I call this the grand theft of the global commons by China, because China is claiming what belongs to the global commons. The high seas are here. Now, Ito-Aba. Ito-Aba is the largest island in the Spratlys. It's 46 hectares in size. And China claims it is capable of human habitation. And if it's capable of human habitation, it generates a 200 nautical mile EEZ. And if it generates a 200 nautical mile EEZ, it overlaps with the EEZ of Palawan. And this is the overlap. Now, Ito-Aba has a coastline of only 1 kilometer. The coastline of Palawan is about 650 kilometers, but the relevant coastline where the overlap happens is only 495 kilometers. So the ratio is 1 kilometer for Ito-Aba, 495 kilometers for Palawan. What is the significance of that? There was a case decided by the ICJ, Nicaragua versus Colombia, 2012, and this is the official sketch of that decision. Nicaragua had a coastline of 531 kilometers. The combined coastline of the islands owned by Colombia here is 65 kilometers. So a ratio of 1:8.2 in favor of Nicaragua. For every 1 kilometer coastline of Colombia, Nicaragua is 8.2. And the ICJ said that is a substantial disparity. Because it's a substantial disparity, all the waters here constitute the EEZ of Nicaragua. The distance here is only 200 nautical miles. So there's an overlap. And San Andres is an island. It has 2,600 hectares in size. It's a huge island, and Nicaragua conceded that San Andres is capable of human habitation. So both parties agreed. San Andres generates an EEZ. So the distance here is only 200. There's an overlap, but the court said because of the substantial disparity in the relevant coastline, all the waters here belong to Nicaragua, and the islands here of Colombia will be entitled to an EEZ seaward. That's how it was resolved. That's what UNCLOS calls equitable solution. It's just common sense because Nicaragua has a longer coastline, it's a bigger land area, so it must have, of course, a bigger EEZ. And if you apply that to Palawan and Ito-Aba, this is just 46 hectares compared to San Andres, 2,600 hectares. So definitely, if the court tribunal will say this is entitled to an EEZ, it cannot encroach on the EEZ of Palawan. It will be given an EEZ seaward. So we're not bothered. Our position is that Ito-Aba cannot sustain human habitation. But even if it sustains human habitation, it will not affect the EEZ of Palawan. In 2002, ASEAN and China signed a declaration of conduct, and the parties said the dispute in the South China Sea shall be resolved in accordance with universally recognized principles of international law, including the 1982 UNCLOS. Because of this, because it says it should be resolved, the dispute should be resolved in accordance with UNCLOS, we filed the arbitration case under UNCLOS. And when we filed it, after we filed it, China said the dispute should be resolved in accordance with historical facts and international law. So the parameters were changed by China, historical facts. We asked China, what are your historical facts? China said, we have abundant historical evidence, but we will not show you. China never shows us those evidence, so we had to dig the records ourselves. So we look at the maps, the official and unofficial maps of China from 1136 during the Song Dynasty until the end of the Qing Dynasty in 1912 show that the southernmost territory of China has always been Hainan Island. Our own official maps and unofficial maps show from 1636 until 1933 show that the Scarborough Shoal has always been part of the Philippines. That's the oldest map of China that I could find. It's dated 1136 AD. Huayi-2, that means the map of China and barbarian countries, and it shows Hainan as the southernmost territory of China. Why is this map still in existence? It's engraved in stone. You can still see it in the Museum of Stone Steels in Xi'an, China. It's there. It's probably the oldest map of China. Now, throughout the Chinese dynasties, Hainan Island has always been the southernmost territory of China. So this is the last official map of the Qing dynasty that I could find. The Qing Empire's complete map of all provinces, 1896. The Qing dynasty ended in 1912, and it shows Hainan Island in inset as the southernmost territory of China. Hainan Island was always a part of Guangdong province throughout the Chinese dynasties. It became a separate province only in 1988. So, how about the Philippines? This is the 1734 map of the Philippines, printed in Manila. We call it the mother of all Philippine maps. Scarborough Shoal is mentioned here. It was given a name for the first time. We have several maps earlier than this, since 1636, showing Scarborough Shoal as part of the Philippines, but unnamed. No name was given to Scarborough Shoal until 1734. The first name that was given to Scarborough Shoal was Panakot. That's a Tagalog word, Filipino word for danger. Because if you are a captain of a ship and you don't know where it is, your ship will hit the rocks, and that's what happened to a ship called Scarborough. The British tea clipper ship Scarborough hit the rocks, and it ran aground there. That's why European cartographers called this Scarborough Shoal. But that was much later. 1734, we had already had the name for Scarborough Shoal. And this is Los Bajos de Paragua. Paragua is the old name for Palawan. Los Bajos is a Spanish word which means shoals. So these are the shoals of Palawan. Those are the Spratlys. We have older maps showing the Spratlys as part of the Philippines, but unnamed. It was only in the 1734 map that there was a name given to the Spratlys. The first name ever given was Los Bajos de Paragua, given in a map printed in Manila during the Spanish regime. There is no older map, either by Vietnam or China, showing the Spratlys as part of their territory, showing Scarborough Shoal as part of their territory. When the Americans came to the Philippines after defeating the Spaniards, this is the first map that the Americans issued. 1899, they came to the Philippines, 1898. And it shows Bajo de Masinloc. That's the name also for Scarborough Shoal. United States Coast and Geodetic Survey, so this is an official map of the United States, showing that Bajo de Masinloc or Scarborough Shoal is part of the Philippines. Now, when the Qing dynasty ended in 1912, of course, you had the Republican constitutions. The Republicans, led by Dr. Sun Yat-sen, established the Republic of China, and they had several constitutions. First five of their constitutions state, this is the first constitution, 1912. The territory of the Republic of China is composed of 22 provinces, Inner and Outer Mongolia, Tibet, and Qinghai. 22 provinces. Remember, Guangdong is one of the 22 provinces, and the southernmost territory of China is Hainan, which is part of Guangdong. So here you can see that in the first constitution of the Republic of China, China is saying our territory is the same as the territory of the old empire. And this is made clearer in the next constitution, 1914 Constitution of China. It says, the territory of the Republic of China continues to be the territory of the former empire. Now, in 1999, PROC China came out with a book, Regulations of the Republic Concerning the Rule over Tibet. China was trying to prove to the world that China owns Tibet, that Tibet is part of China, by saying that Even during the Qing dynasty, Tibet was already part of China, and that is in our map. But that same map shows that the southernmost territory of China was Hainan. That's the book. You can buy that at Amazon.com. And this is the passage in that book. The territory of the Republic of China continues to be the territory of the former empire, referring to the Qing dynasty. So an official publication of PROC says the former empire means the Qing dynasty. And we all know that the Qing dynasty's southernmost territory ended in Hainan. And that's the same in all the constitutions of China until 1946. They always said the territory of China is the same as the territory of the old empire. So in 1932, the French seized the Paracels, and this is now the start of the creeping invasion of China. When the French seized the Paracels in 1932, China sent a note verbal to the French government. Okay, that's the note verbal of China to the French government. And the note verbal states that after describing the Paracels as composed of two groups, the Amphitrite groups and the Crescent group, the note verbal of China to the French says, these groups lie 145 nautical miles from Hainan Island and form the southernmost part of Chinese territory. Form the southernmost part of Chinese territory. So China was saying, our southernmost territory is Hainan, but it includes the Paracels. Even assuming that's true, then that excludes the Spratlys, that excludes Scarborough Shoal. As late as 1932, China was saying, our territory ended in the Paracels. They tweaked it a little by saying that Hainan included the Paracels. So they came out with this map, that's Hainan, and now you can see the Paracels as part of Hainan. But still, it does not include Scarborough Shoal. It does not include the Spratlys. Now, if you go to the Chinese Embassy website in Manila, you will find this claim. Banyan Island was first discovered and drew into China's map during China's Yuan dynasty. In 1279, Chinese astronomer Gu Sujing performed surveying of the seas around China for Kublai Khan, and Banyan Island was chosen as a point in the South China Sea. What is Banyan Island? Banyan Island is the Chinese name for Scarborough Shoal. In other words, China is saying, oh, we own Scarborough Shoal because in 1279, Kublai Khan sent Gu Sujing there to put up an observatory. Gu Sujing is a brilliant guy, the equivalent of Leonardo da Vinci of China at that time. He was a brilliant engineer, mathematician, astronomer, and he built 27 observatories, 26 on the mainland and one in the South Sea, Nanhai. China calls South China Sea South Sea only, Nanhai. The name South China Sea was given by European cartographers. And this story says Kublai Khan sent Gu Sujing to put up an observatory in Banyan Island, Scarborough Shoal. China was an agricultural economy at the time. They needed a very accurate calendar to know when to plant, harvest, irrigate, and so on. And this guy produced a more accurate calendar than the European calendar at the time. But did he ever set foot in Scarborough Shoal? Well, in 1980, Vietnam and China quarreled over the Paracels. Vietnam said, these are our historical records that we own the Paracels. And China said, no, our records go back to 1279 because during the time of Kublai Khan, Gu Sujing went there and put up an observatory. It was an argument used by, so the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China published this article in Beijing Review. It's an official document. And that article says, the astronomical observation point Nanhai was today's Seizure Islands. It shows that Seizure Islands were within the bounds of China at the time of Yuan dynasty. Seizure, of course, is internationally known as the Paracels. So China was telling the Vietnamese, we own the Paracels because that's where Gu Sujing put up his observatory. Today, China is saying, oh, we own Scarborough Shoal because that is where Gusujing put up his observatory. They cannot do that. But could Gusujing have physically put up that observatory in Scarborough Shoal? Of the 26 observatory that Gusujing put up in mainland China, one still exists today. You can visit it in Hainan province, and this is it. It's 12.6 meter high. There's a sundial, very long. To operate this, you have to be there every day of the year to take measurements. There are measurements here, astronomical equipment here. And this is Gusujing, brilliant guy. But did he ever go to Scarborough Shoal? That's Scarborough Shoal. It's just 1.2 meters above water at high tide. The Asian man is 5 to 6 feet tall. You superimpose that building, it's impossible. If Gusujing built it there, that would have been a greater feat than the construction of the Great Wall of China. Last September 2014, something earth-shaking happened. There was an exhibit in Taiwan of the records of the 9 dash lines. It was an exhibit of the Kuomintang Party. Kuomintang Party was the party in power in 1947, and they were the ones who invented the 9 dash lines. And in that exhibit, President Ma, he belongs to the Kuomintang Party, was the guest speaker, and he said, the 9 dash lines was limited only to the islands, was a claim limited only to the islands and their adjacent 3 nautical mile territorial sea. Ma said there were no so-called claims to sea regions. In 1947, there was only the maritime zone called territorial sea. Beyond that was the high seas. There was no EEZ. So Ma was saying, in 1947, we claimed the islands. We do not claim the sea. We claim only the island, and what was then allowed was a territorial sea. Today, that island can claim a territorial sea, and if it's capable of human habitation, it can claim an EEZ. So with that statement, Ma has aligned Taiwan's interpretation of the 9 dash lines completely in accord with UNCLOS. Why did Ma say that? Ma turns out to be a scholar of the law of the sea. He took up his PhD in law from Harvard, and he specialized in the law of the sea. He was interviewed by the New York Times last October, and he said, there is a basic principle in the law of the sea that land dominates the sea. Marine claims begin with land. Marine claims begin with land. Before you can claim a 12 nautical mile territorial sea, you must have land. You measure it from land. That kills the 9 dash lines because the 9 dash lines do not begin with land. We don't know where it was drawn from. So Ma was killing the 9 dash lines with that statement. And he aligned Taiwan's interpretation of the 9 dash line completely in accordance with UNCLOS. I have no dispute with that interpretation. That's wonderful. If mainland China agrees with that interpretation, then the dispute in the South China Sea is no longer the entire South China Sea, but it will be reduced to the islands in the Spratlys and the 12 nautical mile territorial sea, or whatever maritime zones those islands will generate. I calculate that to be just 5% of the entire South China Sea. We can live with that dispute for the next 100 years. But we cannot live with a dispute where China claims the entire South China Sea, because we fish there every day, we get our gas there every day, we traverse that sea every day. So if the mainland China, if President Ma will not recant his interpretation and mainland China agrees, then I will nominate President Ma for the next Nobel Peace Prize. Now, what is the legal basis of the Philippines in claiming Scarborough Shoal? Well, there was a Treaty of Paris between Spain and the US, which ended the Spanish-American War, 1898. And there were lines drawn, and Spain said, all islands within those lines, we cede to the US. Unfortunately, Scarborough Shoal lies outside the treaty lines. That's why the Chinese are saying, you don't own Scarborough Shoal. It's outside the Treaty of Paris lines. But the Chinese forget, many people forget, there was a second treaty of 1900, the Treaty of Washington,
wherein Spain clarified that it also relinquished to the U.S. all title and claim of title which Spain may have had at the time of the conclusion of the Treaty of Peace of Paris to all islands belonging to the Philippine archipelago lying outside the lines. They had to do this because when the Americans came, they found out there were several islands of the Philippines lying outside the lines. Islands in the Batanes, islands in the south, including Scarborough Shoal. So they made a second treaty, and this is the second treaty. The U.S. paid an additional $100,000 in addition to the $20 million that it paid for the main treaty. So that was the transfer of sovereignty over Scarborough Shoal. And in fact, in 1938, the Commonwealth government of the Philippines were worried that other countries might claim Scarborough Shoal, so they planned to put up a lighthouse there to assert sovereignty, and they had to write a letter to Secretary Colonel Hull asking him permission. And the issue was Scarborough Shoal part of Philippine territory? And this was the reply of Secretary Colonel Hull in a memo of July 27. Because of the absence of other claims, the shoal should be regarded as included as among the islands ceded to the U.S. by the American-Spanish Treaty of November 7, 1900. That's the Treaty of Washington. From 1960s to 1980s, the Americans and the Philippine authorities used Scarborough Shoal as a gunnery range. For more than 3 decades, we issued notices to mariners. That's one of the notices. Bombing and gunnery exercise using live ammo will take place in Scarborough Shoal. That's another notice. Bureau of Coast and Geodetic Survey announced the following navigational warnings to all mariners. Missile firing ranges are bound as follows. So we notified the world. This happened continuously over a span of 3 decades, and nobody protested. China never protested. And we notified the world through the International Maritime Organization. Now, what is China's core objection to arbitration? China is saying that the dispute that we have brought to the UNCLOS tribunal is a dispute of maritime delimitation between 2 states, and therefore it's excluded from compulsory arbitration because China made a reservation. UNCLOS allows that. And that is Article 298 says, Article 298 allows exclusion from compulsory arbitration of disputes concerning the interpretation or application of Articles 15, 74, and 83 relating to sea boundary delimitations. China made a reservation. We will not be bound by compulsory arbitration when it comes to Articles 15, 74, and 83 relating to sea boundary delimitation. What are Articles 15? Okay, Article 15 says delimitation of territorial sea between states. That means you delimit if there are overlapping territorial sea. Article 74, delimitation of the exclusive zone, exclusive economic zone between states. You delimit when there is an overlap. Article 83, the same. You delimit the continental shelf between states if there is an overlap. Is there an overlap between China's territorial sea, EEZ, and extended continental shelf, and ours? This is China's territorial sea. It's just 12 nautical miles from the coastline. This is ours. Definitely no overlap. EEZ of China here, 200 nautical miles from Hainan. Our EEZ is here. Definitely no overlap. None. In this Palawan area, the opposite state is Vietnam. It is not China because China is about 800 nautical miles away. So there can be no overlap here in the Palawan area. Our extended continental shelf will be up to here. If China claims an extended continental shelf on this side, it will be here. Now, we do not know if we will be claiming an extended continental shelf from the zone side because there's a deep trench that breaks the natural prolongation of the continental shelf. But even then, all we have to prove is there is a large area where there is no overlap, and we can question the validity of the 9 dash lines. So this objection of China cannot apply, does not hold water, because there is clearly no overlap as territorial sea, EEZ. In the extended contract shelf, there can be no overlap in this area because our opposing coast is that of Vietnam. And that's enough for us to question the validity of the 9 dash lines. I will now come to the last 2 slides. Why is it important to apply UNCLOS in the South China Sea dispute? If we do not apply UNCLOS to this dispute, then UNCLOS will not apply to any maritime dispute in the rest of the oceans and seas of our planet. And if there is no rule of law in the South China Sea, the rule of the naval canon will prevail. There will be a naval arms race, and that's actually what's happening now. Resources that we need, that we've been putting for education, infrastructure, social services, will have to be realigned and devoted to acquiring warships, warplanes, and missiles. And we don't want to do that. So I end with this question. I call it the Grotian question because the father of the law of the sea is, of course, Hugo Grotius. And my question is, will the world community allow a single state to rewrite the law of the sea so the single state can exercise indisputable sovereignty to almost an entire sea, subject the high seas to its sovereign jurisdiction, and seize large areas of other coastal states' EEZs, which are their legal maritime entitlements under both customary international law and UNCLOS. Thank you for your patience and kind attention, and a pleasant afternoon to everyone.
Ladies and gentlemen, how would you like to be on the other side of this debating partner? No, thank you. Mr. Justice, that was comprehensive and much appreciated. I want to open the floor to questions, and I noticed that we have a lot of people in the audience who have been active in our South China Sea conferences, so I know there's some real experts out there. Let me open the floor to observations, questions, and comments on the Justice's comprehensive presentation. Oh, that's a shy group. Gentleman in the front. Could you please just identify yourself and your, right here, and your association?
Thank you. Todd Wiggins, resident of district. A quick question. I liken this to what happens when you're a kid and a bigger kid comes along and tells you that they want your lunch or your lunch money. And, but the world seems to be getting smaller and the weapons are more powerful and ways of claiming resources are more powerful. So where are we going with this? And what should we do about it? What should the United States government do about it?
Well, thank you for that question. We went to an UNCLOS tribunal because we are no match to China militarily. We brought the dispute to a forum where warships, warplanes, and missiles do not count, but this dispute will be resolved only in accordance with the law of the sea, because we do not believe that we should go to war over this issue. This issue should be resolved in accordance with the law of the sea. All the parties to the dispute have ratified UNCLOS, and UNCLOS provides for a comprehensive dispute settlement mechanism. And the intention of the framers of UNCLOS was that no dispute should be left unresolved by the convention, by the dispute settlement mechanism. So we have brought it there. And if there is a favorable ruling that the 9 dash lines are void, they're contrary to the law of the sea, then we will go to the world. We will ask all the countries in the world to help us convince China to comply with the ruling. Because China already said, we will ignore any adverse ruling, and we anticipate they will do that. So we just want a ruling, because if we go now to the world and say, help us convince China, but the world will say, but where's the ruling? It's your word against China. So we went to this tribunal to get a definite, authoritative ruling that the 9 dash lines are contrary to international law, that they are void. And once we have that, we will go back to you and say, help us convince China to follow international law.
We will sponsor resolutions in every fora in the General Assembly asking the world to ask China to comply with the ruling, to comply with international law. Because there are only two things that will make China comply. Either China voluntarily agrees or China is pressured by world opinion. China needs the world. It has to export to survive. It has to import to survive. It needs ASEAN for its maritime Silk Road. It needs ASEAN, the world, for its AIIB Bank, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So it will have to listen to the voice of the world, especially if there's already a definitive ruling from a tribunal that's impartial and authorized by the very convention that China has ratified.
Question here and there.
Thank you for that really expansive presentation. The air defense identification zone that China has claimed is a relatively new phenomenon, and it differs from the claims of the United States and other countries where the entry into the requirement for notification is based on the right to enter the territorial sea. China's is different than that. Could you expand a little bit on what they claim for the air defense identification zone?
Well, the way I understand it, an ADIS applies to military aircraft. If a military aircraft, the course of the military aircraft is straight to the territory of a state, it has to identify itself. But if it is not, if the course is just sideways, it will not enter the territory. It doesn't have to identify itself. That's the way I understand it. I do not know how China has, China, of course, is no longer enforcing its ADIS over the East China Sea. It is enforcing a quasi-ADIS in the Spratlys right now. Every time we fly over the Spratlys, we get called by a Chinese radio, stay away from the area. So they are, in fact, implementing an ADIS over the Spratlys now.
A gentleman here in the blue shirt.
Hi, I'm Josh. I'm from Johns Hopkins CSIS, and I'm a fellow alumnus from UP Diliman. I want to ask because I read an article online that basically by a China expert, and he said that, well, the reason why the dispute won't settle is because all parties, including China, the ASEAN, and the Philippines, all act in bad faith in terms of following the agreements. Do you agree with this? Do you think even the Philippines is following in bad faith? That's why China is also claiming that, if you follow in bad faith, we'll follow in bad faith, and we can't sell anything.
Well, let's go back to the 2002 Declaration of Conduct, because that's our starting point. Everybody agreed. We follow this. We behave this way so that there will be no shooting war. We agreed there will be no new reclamations, no new takeover of new features. China broke that. You can see there in the reclamation, they completely reclaimed submerged areas. China is saying that the Philippines has been doing that. We have not reclaimed since 2002. The reclamation in the Pag-asa Island, our largest island, happened in the 1970s when we built that airfield. That airfield, I was there a few months ago, is now eroded. We have not fixed it because of the 2002 Declaration of Conduct. If you fly there, your airplane must be able to reverse its engine, otherwise it will go over the runway because at the end of the runway, it's already eroded. And we have been very careful. We have not reclaimed. There are two kinds of reclamation in the Spratlys. Reclamations on land territory above water at high tide. That land above water at high tide is entitled to a territorial sea. And a state has a right to reclaim on its territorial sea. You cannot deny that. There is another kind of reclamation in the South China, in the Spratlys, where what is being reclaimed is completely submerged area. You don't have a right to do that except the coastal state. The Philippines we have never reclaimed on submerged area. We only expanded the runway of an existing large island, 36 hectares. I do not know if Vietnam has reclaimed on a submerged area. I doubt. They have expanded on an existing island. So, but China has reclaimed in many submerged areas. So that's the big difference. Yes.
Back here.
Larry Nix from CSIS. Justice Carpio, a follow-up to the answer to the first question. The position of the United States through several administrations towards all of these maritime disputes in the Western Pacific is that the United States does not make any judgments with regard to the claims issued by the various claimant countries. And this has been a long-standing position. But with your suit before the Law of the Sea Tribunal, has there been, or would you expect your government to enter into any discussions with the Obama administration, with the State Department, over how the U.S. would react if the tribunal rules in favor of the Philippines? Whether the U.S. would stick to this neutrality position, or whether it would change its position to come out with a more negative U.S. position regarding China's claim. Are there any discussions, or do you think there should be any discussions between your government and the Obama administration about this as the tribunal's ruling grows near?
Well, there are two kinds of disputes, the territorial dispute and the maritime dispute. The U.S. has always said that it will not take sides on territorial disputes in the South China Sea. That means Paracels and the Spratlys. I do not think the U.S. will change its position even if we win in the case. However, if we win in the maritime issue, that means that the 9-dash lines are void, and therefore the high seas are open. The EEZs are open, there's freedom of navigation, freedom of overflight. We expect the U.S. to enforce, to assert its freedom of navigation and freedom of overflight over the EEZ and the high seas, because it will now be back up with a definite ruling from the tribunal. The interest of the U.S. in the South China Sea is freedom of navigation and freedom of overflight. It does not take sides on the sovereignty issues over the islands. And personally, I don't think the U.S. will change that. But if the U.S. will assert freedom of navigation and overflight, I think they will assert soon by flying over Subi Reef and Mischief Reef. But with more reason, they can do this if there's a ruling that strikes down the 9-dash lines.
We'll go to this side and then back here.
Justice Carpio, my name is Mitzi Picard, and I'm with the U.S. Filipinos for Good Governance. I know your wife very well from Manila. So anyways, U.S. Filipinos for Good Governance sponsored the visit of the mayor of Pag-asa, June Bituon, last week, and we were pleased and privileged to have his presence, and he met with Ernie and some other think tanks, including the State Department and all that. And from what we gathered, he feels that the Philippine government is not being forceful enough in preventing China from its continued militarization efforts in the South China Sea. That's the perception we got. And I know you're looking at it from a legal point of view, but what about the military point of view? Is it because the Philippine military or armed forces are too weak to go against China? That's one question. The second question I have is, I was working for Asia Society for 8 years, and I never knew China to be compliant with any type of international law. So my thinking is, even if the tribunal rules in favor of the Philippines. I mean, you have China trying to build up AAIB, which is probably going to use it as a pawn in this game. So I just don't have any hopes or optimism for China. Thank you.
Thank you. For your first question, we are very careful because militarily we are no match to China. And the strategy of China is every time we arrest their fishermen, they would respond overwhelmingly. They will seize another geologic feature. So they're just waiting for us to initiate a little problem, and they will seize that to take over an island. And they will say, we started it all. So we are very careful because that is the strategy of China. And we are really no match militarily. That's why we brought this dispute to UNCLOS. On your second question, yes, I share your view. China already said we will ignore. That's why we have to craft a strategy. How do we convince China? We have to get the world on our side because China needs the world also. When the cost of non-compliance far outweighs the cost of compliance, then China will comply.
I just wanted to follow up, Justice Carpio. When you think about deterrence with China, I think there is a agreement between the Philippines and the United States sitting before the Supreme Court now, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. Would you see EDCA as a deterrent to the Chinese, or would you prefer not to sort of deal with this until the arbitrational ruling is decided?
Well, it's under the discussion now by the Philippine Supreme Court, and I'm part of that court, so I cannot discuss that. But let me just say that the U.S. has already stated that it does not take sides on territorial sovereignty disputes over the islands in the Spratlys. So we know that already, and China knows that. And because China knows that, the U.S. will not take sides, then China knows that the U.S. will not be there behind us when it comes to the territorial dispute. And that's the sad part about it, because that's a green light to China to seize more islands like what it did in Scarborough Shoal, because they know the U.S. said we will not take sides. That's the problem there. Of course, we also know that the Mutual Defense Treaty will apply in the South China Sea if a Philippine warship or warplane is attacked by China. That's why China also knows that. That's why you see that old dilapidated ship. They don't want to attack that. They don't want to grab that because that could trigger the operation of the Mutual Defense Treaty. So they're just waiting for that ship to collapse.
Thank you, sir. Young lady here in front. Right here. Up here. Sorry, and then we'll go next back there.
Good afternoon, Justice. Thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Rosemary Seguero. My organization is called Hope for Tomorrow. I'm an American citizen here, though I come from Kenya. Your presentation is very, very great, and looking at what you're talking about the world, talking to China, what they are doing and what they cannot do. I follow up with the lady with compliance with China. Now you can see Chinese have always an agenda. They are all now in African. African leaders need to listen to you. And this presentation, what would you advise them now that China is now going? This is what will come to the end in Africa, just listening to your presentation. Thank you.
Well, I hope they will just comply with the ruling. I hope they will join us in the arbitration, because that will give them a chance to present their side. And I hope they will comply with whatever the ruling will be. Because in the end, if China doesn't comply, this will hound them forever. And we are not alone. Once the ruling strikes down the 9-dash line, there is Vietnam that will take advantage of that. There is Malaysia that will take advantage of it, Brunei, and Indonesia, and the rest of the world that will be affected by the encroachment by China. So I see this eventually China complying in the end. It will take time.
But remember, all the diplomats of China now, all the commodores of China, all their admirals, all their generals, all their bureaucrats, all their Politburo members grew up being taught that they own the South China Sea. And that we have to change. We have to change that mindset. And we need a ruling from an impartial tribunal as a starting point to change that mindset. It will take time.
Mr. Justice, I wonder if I could ask a question to follow up on that. In terms of determination in Manila and in the Philippines, is this determination to see through the case and see through this, it takes a lot of courage, actually, for the Philippines to do what it did. When I travel around Southeast Asia and talk to other leaders off the record, they tell me, we're with the Philippines on this. And I said, would you say so? And they say, well, no, we can't, that wouldn't be helpful. But every one of them says that it's, the Philippines had great courage to take this step. Would that courage, is that courage bipartisan? In other words, you have an election in May in the Philippines. Is it possible that a candidate might be able to win the presidency in the Philippines and say, we'll drop the case. Maybe we just need an economic partner in China and maybe we can step back. Is that a possibility?
Well, we expect the decision of the tribunal to come out sometime mid-year of next year.
Okay.
By that time, the new president will come in by June 30. So the decision will come before the new president comes in. And if the decision is favorable to the Philippines, I do not think that the new president will say, I will give up whatever is awarded to the Philippines under that decision. I don't think he can change it anymore. And I've been talking all over the country trying to explain that the merits of this case, and I do not think there will be support for any president to abandon this case, to drop this case, even assuming that the decision will not come out before the new president comes in. I think the people are sufficiently informed that we should continue with this.
Thank you. Young lady right back here, the black hair.
Thank you. You mentioned that the rest of the ASEAN countries that have disputes with China, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Brunei, will then take this opportunity if, in fact, the ruling is successful. But how do you respond to the comments that the Philippines legal recourse actually derails from the so-called regional efforts, ASEAN efforts, to finally come up with a code of conduct? Because the sense that we got in the region was that, you sort of jumped the gun on the COC process. Please.
Could you just identify yourself?
Sorry, my name is Melly Anthony. I'm currently based at Elliott School, but I'm actually from RSIS Singapore. Thank you.
Oh, great. Welcome.
Thank you for that. Well, we signed the Declaration of Conduct in 2002, and as you've read, it says that the dispute should be resolved in accordance with UNCLOS, and that's exactly what we did because that's what the declaration said. Now, we have to remember that the code of conduct that should be that's being drafted now, but there's no working draft, not even after 12 years, there's not even a working draft. The code of conduct is intended to regulate behavior, to regulate how the parties will conduct themselves with their warships, warplanes, and other naval assets so that there will be no shooting war. These are rules to regulate behavior of states while the dispute is going on. There is another set, that's the dispute settlement mechanism under UNCLOS. That is the dispute settlement mechanism that will finally resolve the dispute on the merits. Because UNCLOS does not regulate behavior of the parties while the dispute is going on. So the Code of Conduct was designed to regulate behavior, not to settle the dispute. That settlement of the dispute is under UNCLOS. So these are two different things. So we availed of the dispute settlement mechanism because it's there. All the parties have signed, ratified UNCLOS. But there is still a need for a code of conduct to regulate the behavior of the parties. So these are two different things. Thank you.
Gentleman here. Here's a microphone coming up.
Domingo Tukaya. I'm a retired Philippine Navy captain. And like Justice Carpio, I myself, I was in Pagasa way back in 1970 when we landed the Marines and claimed the islands for the Republic. There were 7 islands initially. Anyway, I'm really saddened to know that China has did a lot of encroachment here in our areas. In fact, when the Americans left Subic and Clark, I made a threat estimate or a national intelligence estimate about a forecast of what China would do. And true enough, my forecast was that China would make good their plan to have I would say, a hegemony in the area, and that would include the South China Sea. Well, now it's already the truth. I mean, it's there. But my question, Justice Carpio, is this: aside from the Hague Convention, the UNCLOS, are there any other options that are still left with us, with the Philippines?
Well, we have been negotiating with China since 1995. China ceased mischief in 1995, and we asked China to sit down, negotiate. We have countless exchanges of notes verbal to discuss the issue. Every time they encroach, we send a note verbal, we ask for discussion, and nothing has happened. China would say, you are just a small country. Just forget it. You really want to discuss? Okay, concede for sovereignty, and we will discuss revenue sharing. Of course, we cannot do that. I mean, our diplomats have been humiliated. But we've tried to talk with them all these years until Scarborough Shoal happened. So in terms of sitting down with China, negotiating with them, we've done that. And that's a dead end for us. We have to develop a new track. The other track is military, but of course, we are starting from a very low base. The president has been spending more for defense because for the last 3 decades, we have been spending our resources to stamp out 2 insurgencies, the communist insurgency and the Muslim secessionist insurgency. We have neglected our external defense. Now we have to address that issue simultaneously. So we are doing a lot of things, but we have done all that we can possibly do in terms of the diplomatic track.
Thank you, Justice.
Mr. Justice, I think one of the questions in Washington of late is whether the United States should go ahead with freedom of navigation exercises within the 12 nautical mile of the, as you pointed out, the features that would be submerged and then have been built up. I assumed from your presentation that you'd be, if Secretary Carter asked for your advice, you'd say, go ahead.
Yes, definitely.
I wanted to put that on the record. Young lady in the back, please.
Thank you. I'm Janice Chen with Taiwan Democratic Progressive Party's U.S. mission. And it's an honor, Justice Carpio, to be able to hear your presentation today. Since you raised President Ma's statement, I just wanted to dig a little bit more into that. He did make this speech last year at this exhibit, and it was reported afterwards, I believe by The Economist, that he said that Taiwan's claims would be limited to 3 or 12 nautical miles, but that actually did not appear in any of the presidential office statements, the official statements that were released. And then I think there was, The Economist published a correction letter from the Kuomintang's representative in London a couple of weeks after, saying that it was erroneously reported. So I think the broader point really is, I mean, he did say, land dominates sea. He said that in the New York Times, and it's on the record. And I think it's true that the Taiwanese government's position has over time slowly evolved toward more closely with international law and UNCLOS. And the more recent statements from the Foreign Ministry in April and July both explicitly reference UNCLOS. But I think what this shows is I think there's a little bit of just very calibrated ambiguity that Taiwan, whether the government or us in the opposition, we always have to be mindful of. For example, our candidate has said that her government would follow international law and UNCLOS, but the MOFA statements have said something like the spirit and principles of international law and UNCLOS. I think there's a lot of hedging going on, and that leads to my question. Given that Taiwan does face the same pressures of balancing its relationship with China as well as being a good global citizen, what role do you see that it could play? Because it can't participate in arbitration proceedings even as an observer. So what would your government, I guess, hope to see Taiwan do going forward? Thank you.
Well, from what I gather, you're saying that after President Ma's speech was reported, there was a correction. I read the correction, and the correction says that President Ma did not refer only to Ituaba. It also included the Pratas and all the other islands. I don't have any dispute with that. As I said, the 9-dash lines under Ma's interpretation is a claim to islands mentioned in the 9-dash lines map. And it mentions the Pratas, it mentions the Spratlys, it mentions the Paracels, it mentions Dongsha Island, that's Macclesfield Bank, but it never mentions Wangyan Island. Scarborough Shoal is never mentioned in the 9-dash lines. But I concede that kind of interpretation does not conflict with UNCLOS. It's a claim to islands, well and good. And it's a claim to the maritime zones that those islands may possibly generate. I don't quarrel with that. What I quarrel with is that the 9-dash lines will be interpreted to mean that China claims the entire 85.7% of the South China Sea, beyond what is allowed by UNCLOS. Now, if President Ma is now recanting and saying, maritime claims need not begin with land, we can claim the entire sea. That's why I said, if President Ma does not recant, and he can convince mainland China on his position, I nominate him for Nobel Peace Prize. But he should not recant, because it's very clear that he said, maritime claims must begin with land. Perfect. But if he's now saying only in some instances maritime claims begin with, well, that's a different thing. That's not the law of the sea.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you'll join me in thanking the Justice for a comprehensive presentation.